The first thing I saw when I opened the door that morning was a stranger's hand on my grandmother's piano. He didn't even look up when I stepped inside. His fingers dragged across the ivory keys, like he owned them, like 70 years of family history meant nothing more than background noise. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice already shaking. "Who are you?" He finally turned annoyed, as if I were interrupting him in his own house. "I'm with the moving company, ma'am," he said flatly. "We were told this place is vacant." Vacant. The word landed inside my chest like a brick. "I live here," I whispered. He shrugged. "Not according to the paperwork." That was the moment my life split into before and after. My name is Lorraine Whitaker. I was 61 years old that spring, living in a quiet coastal town outside Savannah, Georgia. For 32 years, I worked as a hospital cafeteria manager. Not glamorous, not powerful, but steady, reliable. The kind of job where you know the nurse's coffee orders by heart and remember who likes their toast, burned just a little. The house I stood in wasn't just property. It was inheritance. My grandmother had left it to me in her will after she died 12 years earlier. A 2-story white colonial with a wraparound porch and a stubborn oak tree that cracked the driveway roots every few years. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving dinner, every wedding toast in our family happened under that roof. It was supposed to be untouchable, but that morning, boxes already lined the hallway. Labels read, "Remove to storage." Remove, not protect, not preserve, remove. I felt something cold creep through my veins. "I need to see whoever authorized this," I said. The mover sighed and handed me a clipboard. "Talk to the property manager. Name's Denise Keller. She's the one who signed off." Denise Keller, my husband's name, or rather, my husband's last name. Denise was his niece, and in that instant, the open loop snapped tight in my chest. Because my husband, Mark Keller, had told me he was on a business trip in Chicago that week. But suddenly, nothing about that story felt real anymore. I drove straight to the small real estate office downtown. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped my keys twice, trying to unlock the car. Inside, Denise sat behind the desk, calm, composed, wearing a cream blazer and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Aunt Lorraine," she said, like we were family. Like she hadn't just tried to erase me. "What is going on?" I demanded. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said something that still echoes in my nightmares. "The house isn't yours anymore." The words felt unreal. "That's impossible," I said. "It's in my name. My grandmother's will." She slid a document across the desk. A deed, stamped, notarized, recorded with the county. Transfer of ownership from Lorraine Whitaker to Mark Keller, my husband. My knees nearly buckled. "He wouldn't do this," I whispered. Denise tilted her head. "He already did." Then she added quietly, with a hint of satisfaction, "You signed it yourself." And that was the moment I realized something far more terrifying than losing a house. Someone had forged my identity, and they'd done it carefully enough to make it look completely legal. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the sudden, crushing realization of one detail that made my stomach twist. The signature on the deed looked exactly like mine. I stared at the signature for a long time, hoping it would blur into something fake if I looked hard enough. But it didn't. It was mine, the looping L in Lorraine, the slight tilt in the W of Whitaker, even the little flourish at the end that I developed after years of signing cafeteria inventory sheets. It was perfect, too perfect. "I never signed this," I said slowly. Denise gave a soft, practiced smile. "You probably forgot. Happens all the time with older clients." Older. The word hit like a slap. "I'm not confused," I snapped. She leaned forward, slightly, lowering her voice. "You signed it during the refinancing meeting last winter. Remember Mark said you wanted to consolidate some debts?" That memory hit me like a crack of thunder. Last winter, Mark had asked me to sign a stack of documents at the kitchen table one night. He'd said they were insurance updates, routine paperwork. I hadn't even read them closely, because after 36 years of marriage, why would I? My chest tightened. You tricked me, I whispered. Denise didn't answer. Her silence said everything. I walked out of that office, feeling like gravity had shifted, like the ground itself had become unreliable. I drove back home, hoping this was still fixable, hoping Mark would walk through the door and explain everything. Instead, I found something worse. His closet was empty, drawers cleared, his passport missing, and on the kitchen counter, a single envelope. Inside was a short note in his familiar handwriting. Lorraine, this isn't working anymore. I need to move on with my life. You'll be taken care of. Mark, no apology, no explanation, just the cold efficiency of a man closing an account. That was when the full weight of the betrayal hit. 36 years of marriage, gone, not because of an affair alone, but because of a calculated legal ambush. And as _attached the final blow, my phone buzzed. A notification from the county property record system. Ownership transfer finalized. Effective immediately. I was no longer the legal owner of my grandmother's house. I was in the eyes of the law, excluded. That night, I slept in my car, parked under the oak tree that had grown beside the house since my childhood. The movers had locked the doors. I wasn't allowed inside anymore. I remember resting my head against the steering wheel, staring at the dark windows of the home where I'd once hosted Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. And I kept asking myself one question: how long had they been planning this? Because betrayals like this don't happen overnight. They grow quietly, like mold behind walls, invisible, until the entire structure collapses. Around 3 a.m, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. It contained only 2 sentences. He didn't act alone, and if you want your house back, you need to look at the will again. My heart started pounding, because there was only one person who would know something about my grandmother's will. Someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 15 years. My older sister, Diane Whitaker, the same sister who had once sworn in front of our entire family that she would never forgive me for inheriting the house. And suddenly, for the first time since losing everything, I felt something flicker inside my chest. Not grief, not fear, but something colder, something sharper, the beginning of revenge. I hadn't spoken to Diane Whitaker in 15 years, but her name still had the power to tighten my chest like a vice. The last time I saw her was at our mother's funeral. She didn't cry that day. She didn't hug me. She didn't even sit beside me. She just stood across the cemetery lawn in a stiff black coat, staring at me with a look that said one thing clearly. You took what should have been mine, the house. Our grandmother had left it to me, not because I was her favorite, but because I had stayed. I had cared for her through the last 5 years of her life, while Diane moved to Arizona and visited maybe twice. Still, Diane never forgave the will, and now someone was telling me to look at it again. At dawn, after a sleepless night in my car, I drove to a storage unit facility where I kept old family documents. The manager knew me. He didn't ask questions when he saw my red eyes and trembling hands. Inside unit number 27 sat a battered gray filing cabinet. I pulled open the bottom drawer. There it was, my grandmother's will. The thick envelope felt heavier than I remembered. I sat cross-legged on the cold, concrete floor and read it slowly, forcing myself to focus through the fog of exhaustion. At first, everything looked familiar. The house left to me, some savings split among cousins, her jewelry to Diane. But then, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. A clause near the end, one single paragraph. It read, "In the event that the primary beneficiary is found to have transferred ownership of the property under coercion, fraud, or deception, the property shall revert to the Whitaker Family Trust until rightful ownership is legally restored." I froze. Revert. Not stay with the new owner. Not permanently lost. Protected. My grandmother had anticipated this. My hands began to shake, because that meant something enormous. Mark didn't truly own the house, not if I could prove fraud. And suddenly, the open loop that had been tightening around my throat since that morning loosened just enough for air to rush back in. But then another realization hit. Who would know about this clause? Not me. I'd never noticed it before, but someone else clearly had. Someone who sent that anonymous message. Someone who knew Mark hadn't acted alone. The only person in our family obsessive enough to memorize every word of that will was Diane. I sat there for a long time staring at the paper, feeling anger rise slowly through my body. Not hot anger, cold anger, the kind that sharpens your thoughts instead of clouding them. Because if Diane knew about this clause, then she had known all along that the house could never truly be taken from the Whitaker family. And yet she never warned me. She let it happen, which meant one of two things. Either she hated me enough to watch me suffer, or she was part of the plan. That thought made my stomach twist, because suddenly another memory resurfaced. Last winter, the night Mark had asked me to sign those documents at the kitchen table. He had been unusually cheerful that evening, and when I'd asked why he said something that didn't make sense at the time, "Your sister sends her regards." At the time, I thought it was a joke. Now it felt like a warning I'd completely missed. I left the storage unit and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding. My phone still held Diane's number. I hadn't deleted it. I never could. It took me nearly 10 minutes to gather the courage to call. When she finally answered, her voice sounded calm, almost amused. "Well," Diane said softly, "I was wondering how long it would take you to find that clause." My breath caught. "You knew I whispered." "Yes," she replied. There was a pause. Then she added something that made my entire body go cold. "And if you want your house back, Lorraine, you're going to have to trust me." Trust Diane Whitaker. The words alone felt impossible. "Trust you," I repeated into the phone. "You haven't spoken to me in 15 years. Diane exhaled slowly, like she'd expected that reaction. "Because I knew this day would come," she said. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was patient, almost weary. "That makes no sense," I snapped. "It will," she replied quietly, "but not over the phone. Meet me." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to walk into anything connected to Diane. But then I remembered sleeping in my car, remembered the movers touching my grandmother's piano, like it meant nothing, remembered Mark's note. "This isn't working anymore." The betrayal burned hotter than my fear. Where I asked, "Same place as Mom's old bakery," she said. My chest tightened. The bakery had been closed for 20 years, but the building still stood on a quiet corner in our hometown. It was neutral ground, family ground. 2 hours later, I parked outside the faded brick storefront. Diane was already there, sitting on a bench. She looked older than I remembered. Her once dark hair, now silver, her posture slightly hunched. But her eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, calculating. When I approached, she didn't smile. Instead, she said something that stunned me. "You look exactly like Grandma did." When she realized Grandpa was cheating, the comparison hit like a slap. "I'm not here for family history," I said coldly. "I want the truth." Diane nodded slowly. "You deserve it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were copies of emails, bank records, legal forms, and photos. The first photo made my breath catch. It showed Mark standing outside a courthouse with Denise Keller and another woman, a woman I recognized instantly. Rebecca Sloan, my former coworker, the same woman who had been overly friendly with Mark at every company holiday party, the same woman who once joked while holding a glass of wine at a Christmas dinner, "Lorraine, you're lucky your husband still looks at you like that." At the time, I thought it was harmless. Now the truth hit me like ice water. "They've been together for 2 years, Diane said quietly. My chest tightened. But that's not the worst part. She flipped to another document, a partnership agreement signed between Mark Keller and Rebecca Sloan. They weren't just having an affair. They had formed a property investment company together, and my house was listed as their primary asset. I felt something inside me fracture. Not just betrayal, calculation, premeditation. They hadn't just stolen my marriage. They'd stolen my entire future. I tried to warn you, Diane said softly. You never called, I whispered. I couldn't, she replied, because if they knew I was helping you, they would have moved faster. I stared at her, trying to reconcile 15 years of resentment with the evidence in my hands. Then she said, the one sentence that changed everything. They're planning to sell the house next month. My heart slammed, because if that happened, the legal battle would become nearly impossible. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about proving fraud anymore. It was a race against time. And as Diane leaned forward, lowering her voice, she delivered the first real step of the plan. If you want revenge, she said, we don't fight them in court first. We destroy their company. Destroy their company. The words sat between us, like a lit match near dry grass. For 36 years, I had lived a life built on routine compromise and quiet endurance. I believed in paperwork, rules, impatience. I believed that if you followed the system would eventually protect you. But the system had just locked me out of my own house. So when Diane said those words, something inside me shifted, not into rage, into clarity. How I asked. Diane didn't hesitate. She opened another section of the folder and slid a document toward me. This, she said, it was a business registration for something called Coastal Heritage Investments. Founded 2 years earlier, owners listed Mark Keller and Rebecca Sloan. I noticed something immediately. The company's address. It wasn't their office. It was my house. My stomach twisted. They needed a primary asset to secure their business loans, Diane explained. That's why they rushed the deed transfer. Without your property, the company collapses. I swallowed hard. So if the house ownership is challenged, their financing evaporates, she finished. Banks pull credit lines. Investors panic. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just revenge. It was leverage. But we still need proof of fraud, I said. Diane nodded. Yes. And that's where you come in. She pulled out another document. A notarization record. The signature that validated the deed transfer. The notary's name jumped out at me. Victor Hale, the same man who had notarized documents for the hospital, where I worked for years. A man I trusted. A man who knew me personally. I felt cold. He would never notarize something without seeing me sign it, I whispered. Diane's eyes hardened. Exactly. A quiet realization spread through my chest. If Victor Hale's seal was on the document, either he had been deceived or he had been paid. Both possibilities meant one thing. There was a crack in their plan. And cracks could be widened. That's the first step, Diane said. You confront the notary. Not as an accusation, as confusion. Why? Because people reveal more when they think you don't know the truth yet. I nodded slowly. It felt strange to think this way, strategically, calculatingly, but I couldn't deny something else. For the first time since losing everything, I felt powerful, not because I had control yet, but because I finally had direction. That night, I didn't sleep in my car. Diane insisted I stay at her guest room. It was awkward at first. Two sisters, who had spent 15 years apart, moving quietly around each other like strangers. But something softened as the night went on. At one point, she stood in the kitchen doorway and said quietly, I was angry at you for inheriting the house. I didn't answer, but Grandma knew something about Mark. I didn't understand back then, she continued. She once told me, Lorraine trusts too deeply. One day, that trust will be used against her. My throat tightened. She wrote that clause in the will because of him. Diane nodded. She never trusted the way he handled money. A heavy silence filled the room. Then she added softly, I stayed away all these years because I thought if anything happened, I'd be forced to step in. Her voice broke slightly, and I knew you would hate me for it. For the first time in 15 years, I saw not resentment in her eyes, but regret. And that realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. The next morning, I drove to Victor Hale's office. My hands trembled as I opened the door, because I wasn't just seeking answers. I was stepping into the first move of a war. Victor looked up from his desk and smiled warmly. "Lorraine, haven't seen you in years." His familiarity nearly broke me. I forced a small smile. "I need help understanding something," I said. I placed the deed transfer on his desk. His eyes moved to the signature, then to his own notary stamp. And in that moment, the color drained from his face. Victor Hale didn't speak for several seconds. He just stared at the document, like it was something alive and dangerous. Finally, he looked up at me. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. My heart pounded. "It's recorded with the county," I said. "It transferred my house to my husband." Victor swallowed hard. "That shouldn't exist." A cold sensation spread through my chest. "What do you mean?" He leaned back slowly, rubbing his forehead. "I remember Mark coming to see me last winter," he said. "He said you were sick with the flu and couldn't leave home. He brought documents for urgent notarization." My breath caught. "Did you see me sign anything?" I asked. He shook his head immediately. "No." He said you had already signed them. A sharp silence filled the room. "And you believed him," I whispered. Victor looked ashamed. "I shouldn't have," he admitted. "But I'd known you both for years. I trusted him." That word again. Trusted. It echoed bitterly inside me. "Victor," I said carefully, "do you still have records of that appointment?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I keep copies of identification logs." He opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a photocopy of the ID presented during notarization. I leaned forward and felt my stomach drop. The ID wasn't mine. It was a fake driver's license with my name, but Rebecca Sloane's photo. The room seemed to tilt. "They used an impersonator," Victor whispered. "This is fraud. Clear fraud." My hands trembled. Proof. Finally. But then, a darker realization followed. If Rebecca had impersonated me, that meant she had been willing to commit a felony. Not just an affair, not just manipulation, criminal intent. And suddenly, something inside me shifted from grief to steel. "Victor," I said, my voice steady now, "are you willing to testify?" He didn't hesitate. Yes. Relief washed through me, but only briefly. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. As I left his office, my phone buzzed. It was Diane. "Did you get it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "We have proof of impersonation." There was a pause. Then she said something that made my pulse spike. "That's good, but we need to move faster." Why, I asked. Her voice lowered. "Because Mark and Rebecca just filed a listing agreement this morning." My breath caught. "They're putting the house on the market." The words hit like a gunshot. If the sale went through, everything would become 10 times harder. And as I gripped the phone, staring at the road ahead, I realized the truth. This was no longer just about reclaiming my home. It was a race against the final move of two people who believed they had already won. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to make sure they were wrong. The for sale sign went up 3 days later. I saw it before I even turned onto the street. White post, red lettering, a smiling real estate agent's face printed in the corner like a cheerful lie planted in my front yard. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That house wasn't just walls and windows. It was the place where I learned to walk, where my grandmother taught me how to knead bread at the kitchen counter, where my mother cried quietly after my father left, where I had once believed my marriage would last until death. And now it stood there like a stranger, available, replaceable, for sale. I parked across the street and sat behind the wheel, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. A young couple stood on the porch, talking to the agent, laughing softly, already imagining their future inside my past. The sight nearly broke me, but then something inside shifted again. This wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. My phone buzzed. "Diane, listen carefully," she said without greeting. "The open house is this Saturday." So I asked, "So that's our window?" I frowned. "Window for what?" "To collapse their company." Her words came sharp, precise. "The moment we file the fraud affidavit with the county, the property becomes legally disputed. That triggers an automatic freeze on any sale tied to it." My pulse quickened. "But we need more than Victor's testimony," she continued. "We need financial motive." I closed my eyes briefly. "That's easy," I said bitterly. "They wanted the house." "Not enough," Diane replied. "Courts want patterns, paper trails, intent." There was a pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Which is why you're going to Rebecca's wedding." My eyes snapped open. "What?" "She's getting married next week," Diane said. "Not to Mark. To a man named Daniel Mercer. Wealthy, older. He doesn't know about her partnership with Mark." A cold understanding began to form. "Rebecca is using your house as leverage," Diane continued. "She plans to flip it after the wedding to inject capital into the company. That's how they secure their next round of loans." My hands trembled slightly. "They're building their future on my life," I whispered. "Yes," Diane said quietly. "And that's exactly why we take it apart." I swallowed. "How does the wedding help us?" "Because Rebecca has one weakness," Diane replied. "What?" "Her ego." That word hung in the air. People like her, Diane, continued love to brag when they think they're untouchable. Weddings are emotional pressure cookers. Alcohol flows, secrets slip. I felt a slow, dangerous clarity settle in my chest. "You want me to get her to talk?" "Yes," Diane said, "and record it." The idea terrified me. I had spent decades avoiding confrontation, smoothing over conflicts, keeping peace. But now, peace had cost me everything. And suddenly, I realized something else. Rebecca didn't fear me. She saw me as harmless, old, defeated. That was her greatest mistake. Saturday morning, I walked into the open house like a ghost. The agent froze when she recognized me. I'm sorry," she stammered. I smiled politely. "I just came to say goodbye," I said. It wasn't a lie. I walked slowly through each room. The kitchen where I had baked Thanksgiving pies. The living room where my grandmother's piano still stood. The staircase where Mark once carried me, laughing after our wedding reception. Each step hurt, but the pain no longer felt like weakness. It felt like fuel. In the dining room, I noticed something that made my heart skip. A framed photo on the table. Mark and Rebecca standing inside my house, smiling, like they already owned the world. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and snapped a picture because something told me that image would matter later. As I walked out, I saw the oak tree swaying in the breeze, its roots still cracking the driveway, still stubborn, still alive. And I whispered quietly to myself, "They think they've won, but they haven't seen what happens when you corner a grandmother with nothing left to lose." Rebecca's wedding invitation arrived 2 days later. Diane had managed to obtain a copy through one of her contacts. It was elegant. Cream paper gold lettering, soft calligraphy that announced a life built on appearances. "Rebecca Sloan and Daniel Mercer request the honor of your presence." The date was 1 week away. Location, a lakeside country club outside Savannah. I stared at the card for a long time. My hands were steady now. That was new. Fear used to make them shake. Now it sharpened them. Diane watched me from across the kitchen table. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I do." Because this wasn't just about reclaiming property anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Victor filed his preliminary affidavit with the county, flagging the notarization as suspicious. Diane began compiling financial records, linking the house to coastal heritage investments. And me, I prepared for confrontation. I bought a simple navy dress. Nothing flashy, nothing that would attract attention, just something that reminded me I was still a woman who deserved to stand upright. On the evening of the wedding, I arrived early. The country club glowed with soft golden lights. String lanterns hung from trees. A string quartet played near the lake. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. I slipped inside quietly, blending into the crowd of guests. Rebecca stood near the entrance, greeting people. She looked radiant in her white gown, confident, untouchable. When her eyes landed on me, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then it returned brighter than ever. "Well," she said sweetly as I approached. "This is unexpected." I met her gaze calmly. "Congratulations," I said. Her eyes searched my face, looking for anger, for desperation. She found neither. "Thank you," she replied. "I hope there are no hard feelings." The audacity nearly made me laugh. Instead, I leaned closer and spoke softly. "You know what's funny, Rebecca?" She blinked. "What?" "People who build their lives on stolen foundations always think the structure will hold." Her smile tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh," I said gently, "you will." I stepped back, leaving her unsettled. The reception began. Music, toasts, laughter. Hours passed. Then, as Diane predicted, the champagne flowed freely, and Rebecca began to talk. Too much. I found her later near the lake, slightly unsteady, her voice loud with confidence. You have no idea, she was telling a friend, how easy it was. Lorraine trusts paperwork more than people. My pulse slowed, steady, focused. I moved closer, quietly, phone recording in my purse. Rebecca laughed softly. Mark handled the husband part. I handled the legal part. Honestly, the impersonation was the easiest step. My heart hammered. There it was, the confession. But then she said something that froze my blood. "After we sell the house," Rebecca added smugly, "we're disappearing anyway. Daniel's money will make sure no one can touch us." Disappearing, running, the timeline had just accelerated. And as I stood there listening, one thought crystallized with terrifying clarity. We were running out of time. For a few seconds, after Rebecca said the word, disappearing, I couldn't hear anything else. The laughter around us faded into a dull hum. The music from the string quartet sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. All I could focus on was the recording app silently blinking inside my purse. Still capturing, still listening. Rebecca lifted her champagne glass and laughed again, the sound sharp and careless. Honestly, she told her friend Lorraine, we'll probably still be trying to figure out what happened while we're already in Europe. Her friend frowned slightly. Isn't that risky? Forgery is serious. Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. Please, we covered everything. The notary signed, the deed recorded. Once the house sells, there's no going back. My chest tightened. She believed that. She truly believed she had won. And that belief made her reckless. Because she had just revealed something critical. The sale hadn't happened yet, which meant there was still time. I stepped away quietly, moving through the crowd until I reached the parking lot. My hands trembled slightly as I called Diane. She confessed. I whispered. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Everything. Yes. Impersonation. The plan. Even that they intend to run. Diane didn't speak for a moment. Then her voice came out calm and precise. Good. That gives us intent and admission. My pulse quickened. What do we do now? Now, she said, we trigger the freeze. The next morning began before sunrise. Diane and I sat inside her kitchen documents, spread across the table like pieces of a battlefield map. Victor's sworn affidavit, the forged ID copy, financial records linking the house to Coastal Heritage Investments. And now, Rebecca's recorded confession. Diane placed the final document on top, an emergency petition for fraud dispute. This goes to the county recorder and the court simultaneously, she said. Once filed, the property title enters legal suspension. My heart pounded. How fast will it take effect? Immediately, she replied. We drove to the courthouse together. I remember the weight of the folder in my hands. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like justice, waiting to be acknowledged. When the clerk stamped the filing with the official seal, a sound echoed inside my chest, a deep, steady thud, like a door finally closing on fear. The clerk looked up at me kindly. "This will place a legal hold on any sale activity," she explained. I nodded slowly. "Thank you." But the moment we stepped outside, Diane's phone rang. She listened briefly, then looked at me with a tight smile. "They already tried to finalize a preliminary offer this morning." My stomach twisted, and now I asked. "Now they can't." Relief flooded through me so suddenly it made my knees weak. For the first time since I'd seen that moving truck in my driveway, I felt like I could breathe. But Diane's expression didn't soften. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because once they realize what we've done," she replied, "they'll panic." Her eyes hardened, and desperate people are dangerous. She was right. That evening, as I returned to Diane's house, my phone buzzed. Mark. His name on the screen felt like a ghost reaching through time. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but I didn't. I answered. His voice came through tight with anger. "What did you do?" I stayed calm. "I protected what's mine." "You froze the property," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've caused?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Consequences." There was a long silence. Then his voice dropped into something colder. "You should have taken the settlement and walked away." Settlement. The word struck me like a slap. "You never offered one," I said. "You didn't give me time," he replied bitterly. "Now you've ruined everything." Something inside me settled completely in that moment, because I finally understood. This wasn't about love lost. It wasn't about a marriage ending. It was about greed, and he had never expected me to fight back. "I'm just getting started," I told him. Then I hung up, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. 3 days later, everything exploded. It started with a certified letter delivered to Diane's house. A lawsuit notice. Mark and Rebecca were suing me for defamation and financial interference. I stared at the documents, my stomach twisting. "They're trying to intimidate you," Diane said calmly. "It looks serious," I whispered. "It is," she replied, "but it's also a bluff." She pointed to a line in the complaint. "They're claiming you fabricated fraud allegations. That's risky for them." Why, I asked. "Because once they file a civil case," Diane explained, "all their financial records become discoverable." A slow realization spread through me. "They're exposing themselves." "Yes," she said, "out of panic, and panic leads to mistakes." That truth became clear faster than we expected. 2 days after filing their lawsuit, Mark made his biggest error. He tried to move company funds offshore. Diane's contact at a financial compliance office flagged the transfer immediately. Because once a property tied to a company is under fraud investigation, large financial movements trigger automatic scrutiny. That single mistake changed everything. Within 48 hours, the State Financial Crimes Unit opened an inquiry into Coastal Heritage Investments. Subpoenas followed. Bank accounts frozen. Rebecca's wedding honeymoon canceled. Their carefully built world began collapsing, piece by piece. But the moment that stayed with me most happened 1 week later. I was standing in Diane's kitchen when the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Mark stood there. He looked different, older, smaller somehow. Gone was the confidence he used to wear like armor. Now his eyes were tired, desperate. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "There's nothing left to discuss," I replied. His jaw tightened. "You're destroying both of us." I looked at him steadily. "No," I said. "You did that the day you chose betrayal." He swallowed hard. "You don't understand what's coming," he whispered. "Rebecca is talking to investigators." My heart skipped. Talking, cooperating. That meant one thing. "She's going to blame you," I said. His silence confirmed it, and suddenly I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear, real fear. "Lorraine," he said softly, "please, call off the investigation. We can still settle." The word settle sounded so small now, so meaningless. Because this had never been about money. It was about dignity, about truth, about karma finally arriving after years of quiet injustice. I shook my head. No, I said calmly. And as I watched him walk away, shoulders hunched under the weight of consequences, I realized something profound. Revenge doesn't always feel like fire. Sometimes it feels like silence. The steady, irreversible silence of a life built on lies finally collapsing. The official charges were filed 2 weeks later. I remember the exact moment Diane read them aloud at her kitchen table. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching dust in the air like tiny floating stars. Her voice was steady. Forgery, identity theft, fraudulent property transfer, financial conspiracy. Each word landed with a quiet final weight. Not dramatic, not loud, just irreversible. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, listening as if the charges belonged to someone else's life. But they didn't. They belonged to the man I had once trusted with everything, and to the woman who had smiled at me across office holiday parties while planning to erase me. Diane placed the documents down and looked at me carefully. "How do you feel?" she asked. The question surprised me. I searched inside myself for anger, for rage, for the kind of burning satisfaction revenge stories always promised. But what I found instead was something quieter. "I feel calm," I said slowly. And it was true, because the chaos that had swallowed my life months ago had finally settled into something solid. Truth. And truth has a strange way of stabilizing even the most broken ground. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom wearing the same navy dress from Rebecca's wedding, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because it reminded me of the moment I stopped being powerless. Mark avoided looking at me the entire time. Rebecca looked once, just once. Her eyes met mine across the room. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the polished charm. What I saw instead was something raw. Regret. Not regret for hurting me. Regret for getting caught. Victor Hale testified first. His voice shook slightly as he explained how he had been deceived into notarizing documents without witnessing my signature. Then, the financial investigator presented the bank records. Offshore transfers, hidden accounts, the clear trail of money built on my house. And finally, the judge listened to the audio recording. Rebecca's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. Casual, laughing, confident, talking about impersonation, like it was nothing more than a clever trick. When the recording ended, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to touch. The judge removed her glasses and spoke quietly. "There is sufficient evidence to proceed with criminal prosecution and to invalidate the property transfer immediately." Invalidate. The word settled over me like a long-awaited exhale, because it meant something simple, something powerful. The house was legally mine again, not just in memory, not just in sentiment, in law, in truth, in reality. As we left the courthouse, Diane squeezed my hand. "You did it," she said. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "We did it." Because revenge, I had learned, isn't always a solitary act. Sometimes it's built from quiet alliances, from people who step in when everything else falls apart. A week later, I returned home. The movers were gone. The for sale sign had been removed. The oak tree still stood stubborn and strong beside the driveway. I stepped onto the porch, slowly, my heart pounding, in a way that felt almost unreal. For months, I had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, it felt softer than I expected, like returning to a place that had waited patiently for me to come back. Inside the house smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the floors. Everything was exactly where I had left it, except for one thing. On the dining table sat the framed photo of Mark and Rebecca that I had seen during the open house. Someone had left it behind. I picked it up and looked at it one last time. Then I turned it face down, not out of anger, but because it no longer mattered. The first Thanksgiving, after everything happened, was quiet. Just Diane and me. No extended family, no crowded tables, no forced conversations. And for the first time in decades, it felt peaceful. We cooked together in the kitchen the way we had as children. Diane burned the rolls slightly, just like she used to. I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in years. Not sharp, not defensive, just light. At one point, she paused while slicing vegetables and looked at me carefully. "You know," she said, "I always thought revenge would change you." "It did," I replied softly. She raised an eyebrow. "How?" I considered the question. "It didn't make me harder," I said slowly. "It made me clearer. Because revenge, when it's rooted in justice rather than cruelty, doesn't poison you. It restores balance. It closes wounds that would otherwise bleed forever." Later that evening, after dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp. The oak tree rustled gently in the wind. I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair and looked out at the familiar street. For months, I had thought losing everything would break me beyond repair. But what I hadn't understood then was something my grandmother once told me when I was a little girl. She said, "People can take your comfort, Lorraine. They can take your security. They can even take your home for a while. But they can never take your truth. And truth always finds its way back." Now sitting there in the quiet glow of the porch light, I finally understood what she meant. Because the real victory wasn't getting the house back. It wasn't watching Mark and Rebecca face consequences. It wasn't even the legal justice. The real victory was something deeper. It was reclaiming my voice, my boundaries, my ability to stand up for myself after decades of silence. It was the rebirth that comes when a woman realizes she is not as powerless as she was taught to believe. I leaned back in the rocking chair, feeling a calm settle into my bones. And I thought about all the women out there who might be listening to a story like mine right now. Women who had trusted too deeply, loved too quietly, endured too long. So if you're one of them, if you've ever been betrayed, excluded, or made to feel invisible, let my story remind you of one simple truth. Karma may move slowly, but it never forgets an address. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destruction. It's survival. It's standing tall. It's rebuilding your life stronger than before. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and the quiet strength that lives inside every woman who refuses to stay broken.